Welcome to The Arthropologist. Today we're going to be talking about a series of books that have been a part of my life for getting close to 40 years. I guess in the mid 80s, around 1985, maybe 86, something like that, I read the first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, and it just blew me away. I just loved it. And I think maybe a year later, I discovered the second Chronicles. I went back and reread the first and then read the second. And a few years later, read all 6 books again. And here recently, I just got through listening to the first Chronicles, the first 3 books, as a book on tape, and thoroughly enjoyed that. I'm telling you all this to let you know that far from being a detractor of the books, I'm actually a big fan. I've, of course, like all of the reviews you're going to hear online, most people do not like Thomas Covenant. He's a very annoying and grating character, but Stephen Donaldson created just some of the most memorable and amazing characters in science fiction, or this is more fantasy, and fantasy as far as I'm concerned. Morum, the Wraiths of Andalane, the Pitchwife, Foam Follower, Vane. Pitchwife and Vane are in the second Chronicles. But just to let you know, these are just some memorable, amazing characters. And so, yeah, I wanted to gush for a minute because, like the title says, I'm really focusing on the theology of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, and it doesn't come out too well for Donaldson. He's inconsistent, and he uses the Chronicles a little bit as a hobby horse to try and beat some people over the head. So let's just go on and get into it. And I'm going to try not to do any spoilers. I'll try to keep things vague. So if you haven't read the books, or if you do read the books and you go, well, that's not exactly how it was. Yeah, that's because I'm not trying to give anything away. So I may be a little not exactly spot on with some of the things I'll describe. Again, just so that it doesn't spoil it for anyone who's not, who hasn't read the books before. So the reason I'm covering this is that, well, one, it's a part of the books, whether people realize it or not. There is deep theology in the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. And I would put the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant as probably some of the greatest fantasy novels ever written. I've read the Chronicles of Narnia. I've read all of the Hobbit books, or the Lord of the Rings books, including the Silmarillion. I've read all of the Frank Herbert Dune books. I've read, oh my goodness, most of the, if not all of L. Ron Hubbard's books, Battlefield Earth, and then that whole long Invasion Earth series. I think it was 10 books. I read all of them. So, I've really read a bunch of this stuff. And a lot of it was a long time ago, but I'm immersed in fantasy and sci-fi fairly much. And so I'm not just speaking out of cuff. I know that all of these writers, they have deep philosophical and theological thoughts that they're trying to project through their work. And there are great works that are great because of the creators, and there are great works that are great in spite of the creators. And in this case, with Stephen Donaldson and the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, there's a little bit of in spite of, because as you will hear, he has this really overbearing propensity toward using antiquated words that people who wrote the thesaurus are having to stop and go, what? Wait a minute, what is that word? They're unnecessary. And that's universally one criticism of the books, is that he just uses these words that are jarring and take you out of the reading experience. And that is a large part what my criticism of this whole theology of Thomas Covenant is that it's jarring and doesn't seem to have a place, and it takes you out of the world. So I've built up, let me get started. First of all, for those of you who don't know, let me give you some background, some history on Donaldson. Donaldson he grew up in India. His father was a medical missionary, and in interviews, if you watch any and listen to any, you will find out that Donaldson did not like that. He felt very lonely, very separated from the rest of the world, very isolated. And you can understand. I mean, he's a young white boy in an Indian world surrounded by millions of Hindus and Muslims, and probably his father would have been working in very depressed areas, because as a medical missionary, you don't go to places and work on the rich and the famous. You go and you work on the poor and the downcast and the downtrodden. And so you're sort of surrounded by very negative, very often very depressing areas. And so you can tell that there's a resentment, because he even talks about it, that he didn't like it and didn't appreciate it. And in later interviews, he talks about that he basically considers religion to be a bane of the world and not very positive. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So I just wanted to give you that background so that you understand that's where leprosy came from, and that's where a lot of these other things come from. So let's get started. When Covenant writes his characters, they are so good. They are so fascinating. I'm going to veer off for just a second and tell you one of my favorite characters is actually in the Second Chronicles, the Wounded Land, the White Gold Wielder, and I can't think of the other one. The character's name is Vain. I'm not going to give anything away. I'm just going to tell you that many authors, when they write and they create these characters, and they have this buildup where you don't know what this character's about. Why are they there? What's their motivation? What's going on with them? And they keep building and building and building. And then when you get to the end, it's kind of a letdown. You're going, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, but it really doesn't live up to the expectations. Vain is not. Vain blew me away. All through it, I was just fascinated with his character. And he played it very under the cuff, or under the cuff. You don't know what's going on. And in the end, when you find out who this character is and what he's all about, it absolutely blows you away. And so, that being said, again, I'm a real fan. I like his work. But when he starts characterizing Christians, oh my gosh, they are the most cardboard, straw man characters. And they take you out, even if you're not a Christian, which I am, and I'm a real Christian. I'm not one of those woke United Methodist Christians that has the trans pastor and all that kind of stuff. No, I'm a real Bible-believing Christian. That being said, none of this is coming from a hurt, wounded feelings or anything like that. It comes from the fact that it's jarring and doesn't have a place, as far as I'm concerned, in his books. Let's get into it. In one book, actually my favorite of all the books, The Ill Earth War, it does have covenant. He goes to a camp meeting, a Christian camp meeting, where there's a fake healer. And yes, I'm aware there are fake faith healers out there, and they annoy me more than they do you if you're not a Christian, because they cast us in a bad light. But he is so ham-fisted and so heavy-handed with those characters. After a while, it just kept going on and on. I actually skipped a number of pages because I just got tired of it. It's like, okay, you don't like Christians, you don't like ministers, I get it. I don't know why you're beating up on them that bad, but okay. So I skipped it. When I listened to it just recently on books on tape, it was the same thing. It was just so heavy-handed, so ham-fisted, that, again, I just skipped most of it because I got tired of it. And it didn't affect anything. You don't miss anything. You're not learning anything new. And that ought to tell you something. Listen, if you're writing and someone can take 2, 10, 15 pages out of your book and throw it away, and it doesn't affect their reading experience, that ought to tell you something. You probably want to rethink your editing process, and you might want to get rid of a little bit of that. But I honestly sat there for a while, and I was thinking, you know what, partner, you need to get off this hobby horse before your saddle sores develop blisters. You've just ridden this hobby horse long enough. So at the end of it, you honestly feel like these Christians are more deplorable than Lord Fowle himself. I mean, you really do. You walk away and you just think, you know, Lord Fowle, well, at least he's got some cool powers and there's something neat about it. Ain't nothing good about these Christians. They're just awful people, period. So, yeah, that took me out of the world, and it just seemed heavy-handed and inappropriate. Okay, lest you think, well, okay, that's one incident. Yes, that's true. Let's stay in the same book. Again, my absolute favorite book, The Ill Earth War. We're introduced to a character, Hyle Troy. Now, again, I'm not going to give anything away except for this. Hyle Troy is also from our earth, our timeline. So he's like Thomas Covenant. He's a man out of place. Well, but the problem is his language. Out of nowhere, all of a sudden, it's Jesus and Jesus Christ as exclamations or swear words. And you're in a world where everybody almost speaks this antiquated King James language, you know, how art thou? Not quite that much, but in that same vein. And all of a sudden you've got this guy with this modern swear word, blasphemy. And as a Christian, I don't like that. But I listen to it all the time. I mean, if I didn't, I couldn't listen to virtually any TV, any movies, any music. I mean, I'm just surrounded by it. But it's just bad writing. And I'm going to give you 2 examples why. If you want to make the excuse, well, that's modern language. That's how a lot of people speak. Okay, fair enough. Right now, Hollywood is so enamored with race swapping in movies. Let's do that. Let's race swap and bring, what's his name? Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle, the black comedian. You can't listen to him for 3 minutes without him using the dreaded N word. Okay. Let's make a movie and let's put Dave Chappelle in as Hyle Troy. Or if you want to be really edgy, pushing the envelope, let it be a white guy. And let him use the N word. You know, he can call Ward Fowle and the Erviles, he can just call them the N word and all that kind of stuff. Doesn't work, does it? And there's some of you right now that the thought of it is just so jarring and infuriating. Well, think about how Christians feel. It's the same thing. Now, if you want to take it out of that context and put it into a religious context, remember this. He did not grow up around Christians. He did not grow up in America with fake faith healers and the Jimmy Swaggarts and the Kenneth Copelands and all those mega preachers. He didn't grow up with that. He grew up again in India where there were millions and millions of Hindus and Muslims, and there are just as many bad players in both of those faiths. Excuse me. Why not bring somebody in like that? Excuse me. Why not bring somebody in like that? Why not substitute Muhammad or Allah for Jesus or Jesus Christ? Try that. Well, first of all, you wouldn't get any publisher to do it, so you got to self-publish. Are you brave enough to do it? Are you brave enough? Are you edgy enough to stick it to the Muslims like you're sticking it to the Christians? No. It's obvious that it's easy to beat up on Christians because, we'll take it. But nobody's going to do that with Islam. And even if you say, well, I'm not afraid of them, I just want to be respectful. Okay, well then respect Christians too. I would really have been just as offended if that were being done toward other religions, because it's disrespectful, and again, it's just out of place. It was jarring and just didn't seem to fit, and it seemed obvious. There again, beating up on Christians. The last incident like this that I'll bring up is there's a physician that's called in to examine Thomas Covenant in our world, in the quote unquote real world. Well, this is a guy, a doctor, who is also a Christian, supposedly, and he's at some sort of a church function. And when he's called into the emergency room to examine Thomas Covenant, he's just infuriated. Why are you taking me away from my church business to take care of these sick people? Really? That's your attitude? You don't want to be taken away from church to go take care of sick people? Just like the camp meeting people, you kind of walk away, or you kind of close the book feeling like this guy is more disgusting than Lord Fowle himself. And again, it's just so unnecessary. Why would you go out of your way to point out that he's a Christian at a church meeting and he's annoyed that he's got to come in and take care of sick people? It's just crazy. And I think fortunately his editors probably at the same time they was telling me, look, dial some of these antiquated words back. They may have been telling him, dial some of this anti-Christian stuff back. That's enough. again, it's a cardboard character. And that's what's so interesting, and what makes my point is that if you look at the other characters that he makes, Moram, Sunder in the second Chronicles, again, Pitchwife, Foam Follower, all of these characters, there's there's empathy that he has for them. And there, even for some of the bad guys, there seems to be some empathy there. And they're not wooden, they're not cardboard, they don't seem to be just straw men that he's built so that he can tear them down. It's not until he gets to the Christians that he does this stuff. And let's talk about the Creator. The Creator in Donaldson's story is so annoying. He's actually my least favorite character of the entire series. And it's because he's just this limp-wristed, milquetoast, wimpy character that he's supposed to be God. He's supposed to be the creator of everything. And yet he's depending on the two most annoying characters, main characters in the entire series. And that's Thomas Covenant in the first 3 books, and then Thomas Covenant and Lyndon Avery in the second series. And she's another very flawed character. And yeah, she can be annoying and kind of whiny too. But that's his God that he's created. And that's how weak and powerless he is, that he's got to depend on 2 very annoying characters to save not just the land, the universe. Because Lord, keep this in mind, the theology that he has created, the pantheon that he's created, it's dualistic. So instead of having a God like the Christian God or even the Muslim God who is all powerful, he started it all and everybody's subordinate to him, it's dualistic in that Lord Fowl and the Creator, they're pretty much equals. And it's only because of some sort of fit of extra strength and outrage that the Creator is actually able to imprison Lord Fowl. And so he's got him locked down. But bless his darling heart, he didn't figure that by doing that, he's doomed the land, and he can't help them out, because if he did, he'll break the wild magic or whatever and release Lord Fowl back out into the universe to wreak havoc on everything everywhere. Okay. Well, let's juxtapose this to the God of the Bible. In Isaiah 45:5, I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God besides me. Psalm 115:3, our God is in the heaven. He does whatever he pleases. Ooh. You'd really have to put Stephen Donaldson into the sort of intellectual crowd, the intellectual atheist or agnostic, and I'll tell you why in a second. And there's one thing that the Western sensibility, the Western intellectual resents, is anybody who thinks they're going to tell them what they can do. The idea that, who do you think you are, God? God? Well, the God of the Bible actually thinks he's God. He's not auditioning for the part. He is God, and he does whatever he pleases. I remember a comedian back in the 1980s making the joke about some rich guy. He said, that this guy had a bank account bigger than God's ego. Well, of course. Now that's blasphemous. Um, but it shows a mindset. It shows a mindset of those who think that, okay, you can have a God, but he's got to be tame. He can't be one of these gods that's actually large and in charge. Um, and they're just very offended that God would have the temerity to be doing what he wants with his creation. Now, the reason I know that this is, and I'm not just conjecturing, the reason I know that this is a lot of his attitude is that, again, I've listened to interviews with him, and one of the things he says is that religion is one of the worst things in the world, that it's just a terrible, terrible thing. And he doesn't like it at all. Well, he also in the same interview says, well, I'm not trying to foist my moral beliefs on anybody through my writing. Well, of course you are. Everyone is. Everyone who writes from a particular worldview. And if you write from that worldview, then you may have good guys and bad guys, moral and immoral characters. But in the end, if we can take a hot button issue like gun control. If you're someone that is absolutely adamantly opposed to individuals owning guns, you might have characters in your book that own guns and use them. But you're not going to write them in such a way that in the end people walk away going, well, I'll bet he's a member of the NRA, and that this author is a loyal supporter of the NRA. No, you're not going to do that. You're going to make sure that people realize that owning a gun by an individual citizen is wrong. That's bad. And the only reason good things happened is in spite of what this character did. So you can't not write to support your worldview. We all do. So there's that. But then, and he also conflates, because he will talk about, he says Islam, this is a relatively modern interview, that Islam is built on the destruction of Western civilization. Well, no, that he's absolutely right. You can watch right now that on Ivy League campuses, you've got young people marching, and these are young, white Americans marching for Islam or Islamic beliefs, and they're talking about, we want the overthrow of Western civilization. Okay, but you can't conflate that with Christians, because Christians aren't running around doing that. But he does that. And yet, he's not beating up on Islam in his books. And, as an aside, I find it, and he talks about Christianity being anti-intellectual. Anti-intellectual? Really? You do realize that all of the Ivy League schools, let's see, William and Mary, Columbia, Rutgers, Brown, UPenn, Dartmouth, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, they were all started by Christians. Christians who believe that all truth is God's truth, and that understanding God's creation is a way of understanding God, and that the truths in math and science and engineering are the truths of God. Modern science is founded on Christian beliefs, a Christian worldview. Galileo, the father of astronomy, Mendelssohn, the father of genetics. He was either a Catholic monk or a priest. Michael Faraday, Leonhard Euler, mathematician. Robert Boyle, I believe, mathematician. Isaac Newton. on and on and on. If you look and you see mathematical proofs and mathematical equations, a whole bunch of them came from Christian mathematicians, Christian philosophers. Modern medicine, well, the Red Cross kind of comes to mind. Also, go anywhere in your city. What do you have? St. Dominic's Hospital, St. Catherine, St. whatever, the Presbyterian, the Methodist, the Baptist hospitals. All of these chains of hospitals came about through the churches, Christians. And then the deepest philosophical thinkers that you'll come up with, most of them will be Christians. St. Augustine, Francis Bacon, Thomas Aquinas, Immanuel Kant, to name a few. Lastly, Jonathan Edwards, a Calvinist minister considered even in the secular world to probably be the greatest philosophical thinker that the United States ever produced. So the reason I point that out is, again, he attacks Islam, and then he attacks, at least in the interview, and then he attacks Christianity. But they're not the same. They're not the same at all. And lastly, what's really interesting is the inconsistency that he has toward another religion. And this gets really good, and it goes hand in hand with the whole atheist intellectual or agnostic intellectual. And that is the paternalistic looking down on religions that they feel are intellectually inferior. And case in point, throughout the books, you've got a group of people, the Raman. The Raman, they are dedicated to horses, and they virtually worship these horses, the Renahin, or Renahin. Where do you think that came from? Well, he grew up in India, where a vast number of Hindus venerate cows. They don't worship cows. That is a misunderstanding. They don't worship cows, but they do venerate them. And they kind of do almost worship. Let me take that back. Some of them almost do. But there's this deep religious veneration of cows. Raymond, and what is the most beloved, or one of the most beloved deities in the vast Hindu pantheon? I think it's Rama or Rama. Rama, Raman. Venerating horses, venerating cows. Direct correlation. Now, there's this idea that started in the 19th century with Henri Rousseau of the noble savage. And so often, intellectuals who will go into one department, the religious department, and just bash Christians as being anti-intellectual and anti-science and on and on and on. And then they'll pick up their books and they'll go into the anthropology department, and they will just gush and ooze all over what are considered to be lesser religions. I can't think of a word right now, but primitive religions like ancestor worship, worshiping the sun, worshiping animals, animism, and then with Hinduism, venerating cows and stuff. Oh my gosh, they would just talk about how wonderful it is and how it's unifying to the people, and there's a rich tradition, and they just go on and on and on. It's like, oh my gosh, give it a rest. Again, get off the hobby horse. And you also want to say, could you share a little bit of that love over here with the Christian community? You know, it, it, it just shows a hypocrisy and a lack of consistency in how he thinks about people of faith. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is, again, he did. He did. Some science fiction authors, they don't bring it up that much. But there are others, Isaac Asimov, the Foundation series. Again, I read them all. And I've listened to all of them at least once on tape. And I enjoyed them. I enjoyed them very much. But he was an ardent atheist, just a virulent atheist. And he would, every once in a while, he would take a little swipe at Christians. And, again, I'd kind of blow past it because, again, he wasn't being intellectually honest and he wasn't being intellectually consistent. Frank Herbert, he had some interesting takes on religion. And I thought it was interesting. Didn't agree with them necessarily, but I thought they were interesting. So I bring them up when the author brings them up. And I think maybe I'll close with this, because you would be thinking, well, again, I'm not convinced. You're only saying these things because you're a Christian and you're offended. Well, I'm not, and if you don't believe it, that's fine. But here's another example of someone I agreed with, and I actually, again, if he were alive and I were talking to him, I'd tell him, get off the hobby horse. And that's L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard wrote a book called, I think it's Masters of Sleep, Slaves of Sleep. At the time, again, I read it when I was in my early 20s, which was now 40 years ago. I loved it. I thought it was great, very imaginative, very well written, just a good story. But, background, L. Ron Hubbard was an adamantly despised communism, socialism, and labor unions. Well, guess what? I agree with you. Frank, I have no use for labor unions, I have no use for communism, and I have no use for socialism. But even when I would agree with him on his philosophical worldview, he would have characters, and he'd have a bad guy. So he'd have a villain that was a trade unionist, and he'd do something nefarious. Well, as he was describing stuff, he'd go, and of course, he ripped everybody off just like a trade unionist would. Ron, come on, dude. I agree with you. But you don't need all of that running commentary. I'm smart enough, and your audience is smart enough to know he's a union boss. He's a trade unionist. He ripped everybody off. That equals bad. You don't have to hammer it over and over. And all through the story, he would take pains to point out that someone was a socialist and did something bad, just like bad socialists always do. Okay, moving on. So there's, again, an instance where I was in absolute total agreement with his worldview. I just felt like he was reducing the characters to cardboard and running this ongoing commentary that was just unnecessary. So, if you're a writer, I'll just give you a piece of advice. Don't discount your audience's, your readers' intelligence Don't believe that they're stupid. If they are, they're not going to get anything you're reading probably. But if you think that your readers have any intelligence at all, if you're a halfway decent writer, then if you create a character that's got bad traits, they'll pick up on it. And if they got bad traits because they are a X, a Christian, a Muslim, a trade unionist, a communist, whatever, they'll get it. They'll get it. You don't have to. You don't have to hold up a sign and say, "Oh, don't forget they're bad because." So, yeah, that's just my little advice to you if you're a writer. So, those are my. That's my thought on the theology of Thomas Covenant. I think it's flawed. I believe that it would have been better had he dialed all of that back and not been so heavy-handed. And I'm not encouraging anyone to go around beating up on anybody with their books, with their work. I'm just saying, and I'm not saying don't. What I'm saying is, if you're going to create characters and you're going to have, you're going to build a world around them, make them three-dimensional, and don't create cardboard, cookie cutter, cutout characters that have no relation to any sort of real world scenarios. And then lastly, it's obvious that Donaldson had his own demons he was trying to work out. Well, that's not for your books. That's for your psychiatrist couch or your minister or whatever. If you've got all these deep-seated issues, don't try to shove them into your characters. Don't create scenarios that don't really fit and then shoehorn them in. Instead, write your stuff, make a good story, and then go lay on your psychiatrist couch for an hour and vent all your frustrations over whatever happened in your childhood. So that's my thoughts on Thomas Covenant. Again, I am a fan. I do enjoy them. I'll probably read them again, and I'll just bleep over a lot of the stuff I don't care for. But I encourage you to read them. They are good. And if you have comments, if you disagree, that's fine. I would appreciate your thoughts on the matter. So thank you for listening. If you like my content, I'd appreciate you subscribing, commenting, and giving me a thumbs up. So I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm the Arthropologist.